we see different type of movements happening in living organisms around us to perform a variety of functions. This kind of functioning or the movement is facilitated with the help of the nervous system. So, in this video, we are going to start with the basic unit of the nervous system. Those are the neurons. Our brain, which is considered to be the most complex organ of our body, is in fact composed of over 100 billion small units called neurons. So, what does the neuron do? These communications are important to bring about any kind of movement in our body. Out of these movements that are performed by the living organisms in their day-to-day life, there are certain movements which incorporate the motion from one place to another, which is known as the locomotion. The locomotion involves activities such as walking, running, swimming, etc. The next kind of movements are somewhat related to the growth or the overall survival of the organism, such as which are not associated to the displacement of an organism's body, such as breathing, beating of heart, etc. So these are the movements related to the growth. While there are also movements which might not be related to locomotion as well as are unrelated to the growth. Such kind of motions are certain kind of facial expressions such as laughing or smiling, talking or writing, listening, etc., which are performed by an organism in their day-to-day life. So how do organisms control and coordinate such movements? So this kind of systemic working of different organs is performed by the nervous system. For any multicellular organism, the systemic working of different organs is performed by the nervous system. Let us look into what are the different parts and functions of the nervous system in humans. So, a nervous system comprises of 4 main parts, that is, the brain, the spinal cord, the sensory organs which have the sensory tissues in them, and all the nerves which connect these organs, that is the brain, spinal cord and sensory organs, to the rest of the body. We will begin to understand the working of the nervous system from its basic unit. Those are the neurons. So what is a neuron, or how does a neuron look like? A neuron is a specialized cell that is designed to transmit information to other nerve cells or other neurons, to other muscle cells, to other gland cells or other different kind of cells into the body. There are 100 billions of neurons that are present in our body, which are composed of different types and structures. Our brain itself has over 85 billion neurons. Let us first discuss what a generic or a typical neuron looks like and the common structures of any neuron. So, as it can be seen here, the structure of any neuron includes the cell body. From the cell body, many appendages or fine structure arises which are known as the dendrites. It also has an axon, which is an extension from the cell body as seen here. There are axon terminals. Those are the small projections which are opening from the end of the axon and are divided into many branches. So these are the axon terminals. And finally, at each terminal, there is a knob-like structure present, which is known as the synaptic knob. So as you can see here, there are different categories of neurons which are present here, and as we discussed, each of the neuron has all of the 5 basic structures, that is the cell body, the dendrites which are the appendages arising from the cell body, the axon which is a pipe-like structure arising from the cell body, the axon terminals are the branches present at the end of the axon, and the synaptic knobs which are present at the end of the axon terminals. As you can see here, the neurons are broadly classified into 3 types, which is based on their function, that is the sensory neuron, the relay neuron and the motor neuron. We will discuss about each of them later. Talking about the individual parts of any typical neuron, it consists of an bulbous part which is known as the cell body. Now, within this cell body, there are many structures present, which are the centrally placed nucleus. Then there is Golgi apparatus. It has the mitochondria. And there are special granules which are present around the nucleus into the cell body, which are known as the Nissl granules. Or, in a simple term, they are the ribosomes attached to the endoplasmic reticulum or the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And these all organelles are suspended within the cytoplasm inside the cell body. Now, this cell body gives rise to many appendages or extensions in all the directions, which are known as the dendrites. So as you can see here, these are the extensions from the cell body, and here it is an extension from the cell body arising from the axon. These appendages help to receive the information via the receptors which are present on them. And these are the chemicals that they receive in the form of signals from the other neurons. So this is something that we will discuss later as to how these chemical signals are obtained by the dendrites, or simply they receive signals from the other neurons. There is a long extension which is arising from the cell body, and it is known as the axon. This helps to transmit the information signals. So the information which is received by the dendrites is first processed into the cell body, and then it is passed to the axon in order to be transmitted to the next neuron. This kind of transmissions cause certain electrical changes, and so the axons are wrapped around by an insulating coat called the myelin sheath. So around this tube-like structure which is present in the center called the axon, there are thin coats which are insulating coats around the axon called the myelin sheath. It helps to increase the transmission of the signal across the neuron, and it prevents the degradation of the electrical signal. Finally, there are branches which arise from the end of the axon, which are known as the axon terminals, and their endpoints are round button-like structures. So these structures are known as the synaptic knobs. Many neurons wrap together in order to form a nerve. So now, as we saw just now, that this is the structure of a single neuron. So how does this neurons form a nerve? So many neurons are wrapped together into a covering and are aligned into a line in order to form a nerve or the nerve fiber. Hence, a continuous transmission happens from one neuron to the other in order to reach the final organ, which would be the brain, where the signals are need to be transmitted or processed. So now, as we had discussed before, there are three broad categories of the neurons, that is the sensory, relay and motor neurons. Let us see how these neurons work in harmony. There is a chain that is formed with the help of the three kinds of neurons. So this chain first includes the sensory neuron, which then transmits the signals to the relay neuron, and then finally they are transmitted to the motor neuron. So the sensory neuron will be in contact to the sensory tissues from where the signals are arising, and the motor neuron will be in contact to finally the information would be sent out to the affected tissues with the help of the motor neuron. So the sensory neurons are the specialized neurons that take up the signal. So as you can see, the stimulus is traveling through the neuron and moving into the cell body in order to get processed. This is taken up by the stimulus from the external environment through the sensory tissues, and it converts into a signal which has to be sent out to the brain. So now, as you can see, the signal from the sensory neuron, from the axon terminals of the sensory neuron, is being now transmitted to the dendrites of the next neuron, which is the relay neuron. So why it is called a relay neuron? It is an intermediate neuron that receives the signal from the sensory neuron and transfers the message to the motor neuron. Hence, it forms the relay arc of the overall mechanism. Once the signal is transmitted, it again gets processed into its cell body and is passed on to the next neuron, which would be here the motor neuron. Again, these signals, as you can see here, from the axon terminals are transmitted or are passed to the dendrites of the motor neuron. So finally, being processed into the cell body, they transfer the signal or the controller's message from the brain, which would have been processed, to the target muscle. So the motor neurons are always in contact to a target muscle or the effector tissue where they have to be worked upon in order to act into a particular fashion. So this kind of signal transmission performs two types of movements. One is the behavioral response. Those are the physical responses which are again governed by consciously by an organism, such as walking or running, talking, eating, etc. While the responses could also be physiological. So these are the responses which comes from within the body. So partly these are the movements which are performed subconsciously by the body, such as respiration, beating of heart, or growling of stomach. So now that we are aware of the structure of the neuron, let us understand how a neuron functions. So we have already looked into how a signal is transmitted between the two neurons, which is the exchange of certain chemical molecules between the axon terminal and the dendritic appendages. But what exact kind of exchange has been taking place between these two structures? So let us see how the communication between the neurons takes place. Now we know that how an electricity is conducted within the wires. It is due to an potential change where the electrical ions move from a negative charge towards the positive charge. Hence, in the same way, an action potential is generated or a potential difference is generated between the two neurons in order to carry out the transmission of the signals from one neuron to the other. So the response or the signal that we are talking till now, which is generated into a neuron and is transmitted to the next neuron, are called the neurotransmitters. So these are certain kind of chemical special messengers or messengers that take the information from one neuron to the other. So as you can see, this signal is nothing but the electrical potential which are traveling through the neuron 1 to the neuron 2. Now, during this process, an action potential is generated, which directs the flow of the chemicals from one neuron to the other. So now, the region between the axon of the first neuron and the dendrites of the other neuron is known as the synapse, where the exchange or the transmission of the neurotransmitters takes place. So in between two neurons, the tiny gap that is present between axon terminal of one neuron and dendrite of the other neuron is known as a synapse. So now let us consider this neuron 1, from where the signal had been generated to be the signaling neuron or a presynaptic neuron cell, and the one where the signal is going to be transferred, the other neuron, be the receiving neuron or the postsynaptic neuron or cell. So as you can see, the presynaptic cell has the synaptic knob is communicating with one of the dendritic appendage of the next neuron. Also, the dendrites of the next neuron have the receptors which we had discussed before, which would take up the signal coming from the neuron above. This is the synaptic gap or the synaptic junction which is present between them. The neurotransmitter vesicles that are already present at synaptic knob, and due to the electrical impulse, many calcium ions move into the synaptic knob, which subsequently leads to the release of the neurotransmitters from the vesicles into the synaptic knob. Now, as soon as these neurotransmitters are released, they bind to the receptor present on the dendrites, and hence this signal is passed on to the next neuron. This neurotransmitter causes a change in the voltage across the neuronal membrane. It carries the electric signal in the form of action potential to the length of the neuron. So this is how the signal gets passed to the next neuron, gets processed into the cell body, and again moves on towards the axon terminals in order to be passed to the next neuron. So like other cells, the neurons, other from signaling the information from one cell to another, also carries out the other metabolic functions like the cells too, because We have already seen that it consists of all the possible molecular organelles which are required for a cell to metabolically function. So in this video, we understood what is the structure of a neuron like and how it functions. In the next video, we are going to discuss about the other two parts of the nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord, which combinedly form the central nervous system.